Hi all, this is Anya, and I wanted to do a little video on the Dreams of Gaia deck. So, if people aren't familiar with it, the Dreams of Gaia deck is I want to say a relatively new deck. I received it in 2016, at the end of 2016, and I think it came out September 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Created by Raven Falan. If you guys haven't seen this deck, I highly recommend at least looking up some pictures for it. It is a gorgeous deck, and it is probably my favorite to work with. But that being said, it does deviate quite a bit from the standard Rider Waite Smith deck, so I thought it would be fun to just sort of make a video and kind of do a mini comparison between the Dreams of Gaia deck and a Rider Waite Smith style deck, just to kind of give you some of the key points that I think make it different, that make it stand out. I'm not going to do every single card. I've kind of tried to just narrow it down to 3 of the biggest changes, so I'll just try to go over those, and at a later date maybe I'll try to do breaking it down by each suit, major arcana versus every suit. But we'll see. I just wanted to sort of start off with this. So the deck I'll be comparing it to is the Golden Universal Tarot. I do not own the standard Rider Waite Smith deck, so I'm going to try to work with this as best as I can. So bear with me, please. I've my very first video, so still learning here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is something that I've been saying about this deck since I got it and started working with it. I think this deck, in my opinion, leans towards the positive side of cards and interpretations. It seems as though a lot of the imagery is a lot more positive when you compare them to some of the Rider Waite Smith decks or cards that might have some negativity in it. And I'm going to use the sword suit as an example. So anyone that's worked with tarot knows that the sword suits can have an awful lot of negative imagery. The deck that comes to mind when thinking about this negative imagery is actually the Wild Unknown. I think the Wild Unknown had some cards that when I looked through them, they really stuck out in terms of the sort of scary imagery for the swords suit. And I kind of interpret that as, the mind can just be a really, really tough and scary place to be, and if you don't really work on your thoughts, it can lead you to have, just nightmares and a lot of scary stuff. And that obviously goes for any suit that you work with. Emotions can be overwhelming, thoughts can be overwhelming. But it seems as though swords especially does get that negative connotation. And I'm just going to pull the 3 cards that I think usually get interpreted, I don't want to say the worst, but, they get interpreted to be a bit more negative. So I've got the 3 of Swords here. This is the 3 of Swords in, again, the Golden Universal Tarot. And this is a pretty standard image for a lot of the Rider Waite Smith decks. You've got your heart with 3 swords through it, pierced at 3 different angles. You've got your figure who looks very disheartened, downcast. And that's sort of the standard image that you would find in a lot of these decks. The Dreams of Gaia one, however, features an angelic figure, all of those in the air suit, which relates back to the swords. Swords is air. All of these air figures do have wings, and what you can see is a figure who is studying a tome, a big book. And the meaning that I always get from this image is just to kind of focus inward, focus on oneself, you can see that this glow from this book that the figure is reading, this glow is smacking the figure right back in the face. So the figure is really sort of being told to focus on their own journey, their own life, their own self. And I mean, you can relate that back to sort of the heartbreak that one might see in the Three of Swords. You know, one of the bits of advice that we always give people who, you know, are struggling with their thoughts, or they have pain, heartache in their life, is to focus more on themselves, do some soul searching, figure out who you are. And I think that's what this card is saying. And that's sort of why I see it as a little bit more positive of an image than this this heart with the three swords through it. You can find similarities in message, but it is quite a bit different. The next one, another big one, is the Nine of Swords, or the Nine of Air, depending upon what kind of deck you're using. So here we have the Nine of Swords in the Golden Universal. And again, this is a pretty standard image for Rider Waite Smith decks. You have a figure, usually laying in bed, surrounded by swords, usually at their head, sort of indicating, you know, a struggle with one's thoughts, unable to sleep, just a lot of thoughts going on there, and causing a lot of disruptions in their everyday life. Whereas instead, and I think this is a complete deviation from the meaning of Nine of Swords, but I'm totally okay with it. I love this card. This card features, again, an angelic figure. You can kind of see the wings here. An angelic figure who has a universe in their head, and the universe expands outwards. And this card is meant to represent that we all have the ability to create. If we can imagine it, we can create it. This figure can see the expansive universe through in their mind, in their mind's eye. Literally, you can actually see the mind's eye there in the image. And that thought process can expand outwards. And then you have the hands and the fingers lit up to say that there's action involved too. Sure, you can imagine it, but you also need to act. And I think that's a big deviation from the standard Rider Waite Smith deck. But I think, again, that's one of the reasons why I feel like this deck has a tendency to lean towards more positive connotations of these tarot archetypes that we all think about. And the third example, again in the swords suit, is the 10. And here in the 10, you can see that we've got this figure who's kind of been beaten down a little bit by all the swords, all the thoughts. You know, we can see that as both a positive and a negative. We're at the 10. It means that we're done with this journey. We've completed this cycle. And it's over, but it does mean that because it's, again, swords, and swords can be such a challenging suit to work with, minds and thoughts and logic and all that stuff can be such a strain on us. It does mean that we're going to take some time to rest and be with our thoughts and try to, you know, find the strength to stand again. Whereas instead, with Dreams of Gaia, you have this, again, this angelic figure who is, you know, in the comfort of where they are. You can see that this figure is right where they're meant to be, sort of. You can see that in, like, the color surrounding this figure. This figure blends in perfectly with the color scheme of what's going on around them. You know, but the figure is facing a doorway where they're about to step into a world that they don't really know. You can see it's dark. There's some stars there, but there's just a lot of darkness. So this figure doesn't know what they're stepping into. They're stepping away from the familiar, they're going into the unknown, but they're doing it with their shoulders square, with their wings outstretched. They're going with full confidence into whatever awaits them next. And again, you can kind of see that a little bit in the Rider Waite Smith image. You know that if you're at a 10, you're at the end of this cycle, this journey. And this figure knows that they're at the end of their cycle and journey, but rather than being bogged down by something, they're stepping into this new space with full confidence. And I think that's obviously a beautiful message. And it's through the swords cards that you can really see this positivity just shine through. And I think that's one thing that I've noticed about this deck that I really, really love. And again, you can see some of that in a lot of the suits as well. But I'm not going to dive into all of them. I just wanted to give a little brief overview on how they look in the swords. At a later date, I can do it with the remaining suits. But for right now, we'll just move on. So the other change that is pretty noticeable is that Dreams of Gaia has very different court cards. So in your standard decks, you have the page, the knight, the queen, and the king, or some variant, But Dreams of Gaia deviates from that quite a bit. So in Dreams of Gaia, the card that would normally be a page card has been replaced with a balancing card. And this is what the artist, Raven Phelan, calls it. It's a balancing card, and each balancing card represents the element that each suit goes with. So for example, here we have the balancing card for water, which is obviously emotions, relationships, things of that nature. So the balancing card for water is intellect and emotion. So the reason these cards are this way when you pull them out, and it's a way of being told that there's something out of balance here. And you have to find that balance in between these two things. And I think that's obviously very important, because we do live in a world where everything is so imbalanced. We live in a world that seems to want to teach us there's a right way and a wrong way, and there's nothing in between, that it's got to be good or bad, left or right, right and wrong, and that there's there's nothing else that there could be. But it forgets that there are so many shades of gray in between. And I think these balancing cards are a way to remind us that we do need to find the balance between, each of the things that they represent. So here, a balance between emotion and intellect. The world tries to tell us that intellect is preferred, and that's the way we should work through everything in our life, is using our mind, our thoughts, our intellect. And while that is very good advice, there are plenty of times where we need to work with our emotions as well. Emotions are part of the human experience, and we need them. So I think these balancing cards are a way to remind us that in certain situations, if you pull it out in a reading, it might mean that there's an imbalance going on here. Maybe you're being too emotional about something, or maybe you're being too you're letting your thoughts and your intellect overrun you a bit too much. So that's why these balancing cards, I think, are a very interesting addition to this deck. And since I've just spent so much time talking about this balancing, I'll just quickly grab all of those. So you have Earth. It's the balancing card between heaven and earth. The balance between being spiritual and connecting to your spiritual side, but also remembering that you are a physical creature and living in this world. Yes, it's good to focus on your spirituality and your beliefs and the things that make you you, and the things that just make your spirit soar. but it's also good to remember to keep your feet planted on the ground and remember that we're all here to learn and experience something by being physical beings on Earth. For air, it's body and mind. So obviously finding this connection between our thoughts and our bodies and how they all sort of connect. You know, plenty of studies have been done to show that our thoughts directly impact our body and our physical health. And I think that's, you know, this card is meant to be reminiscent of that. And then the last card, the last balancing card that we have is for fire. And fire is a balance of masculine and feminine. And again, I think this is a big one that we see in society, with everyone leaning to a lot of masculine traits as being better or preferred. It's better to constantly jump into things and take action instead of sitting and watching and waiting and maybe compromising. And again, I'm not meaning that to say that action isn't good. You know, action is sometimes very much required. But to say that we can only live a life where it's one or the other, that there is never an option, there's never an in-between, there's never an opportunity or a moment where compromise is preferable, is wrong, because we do need this balance. And I really do like the addition of these cards in here, because we really do have to find a better balance, not just in ourselves, but in our world as a whole. Okay, so those are the balancing cards, which replaced the page cards in Dreams of Gaia. The other one, each of the cards, each of the suits has a representative or an advisor to the king and queen, because again, the decks do have a king and a queen. So each one gets their own specific sort of advisor. So for water, it's the counselor, which, you know, you can kind of see the element of water, not just physically in there, but in the fact that a counselor, what do we normally think of when we think of a counselor? Someone who works with us on our emotions, someone who is balanced emotionally, but because they are balanced themselves, they can help us work through the things that we're struggling with. So that's how it relates back to their suit. Here in Earth, we have the seneschal, and she, or I always say she because my first impression is she, but actually when you take a real close look at these cards in this deck, so many of these figures are actually very androgynous, which is great. We can sort of see ourselves, whoever we are, or who we're reading for in these characters because of that. But this figure is meant to be just, you know, someone who's very, very loyal to their king and queen, someone who is trusted with the finances, the things of that nature. And if you're going to be entrusted with things like that, you very much need to have the favor of the king and queen. So this is someone who is very loyal, and you can see their animal here is a dog. And as we all know, dogs are very loyal to their humans, their owners. And you can also see there's two ants there as well, which can also be inferred that, you know, ants do a lot of when you think of ants, you think of a whole colony doing all of this work for the queen and for the entire colony. So I think it relates back to talking about the loyalty of that character as well. For air, it's the scribe. So someone who takes their thoughts and dictates them, uses the power of the mind. You can see the sword right there in the figure's forehead. And then you can see the words sort of flowing from their mouth. So the scribe for air. And then the last one we have is the hero for fire. So you can obviously see someone who's passionate and dedicated, but also very fierce. Their animal right there, front and center, is a bear, and I believe that's 2 boars on the side as well. So this very fearsome defender, ready to jump in and act, as we all know fire is meant to do. So those are the differences there in the removal of the page and the knight. And the last thing I'm going to try to run through real quick is just the major arcana cards. The major arcana cards are completely different from the major arcana cards in a Rider Waite Smith deck. And they're broken up into 4 groups. The author, the creator, discusses it in the guidebook. And those groups are, the very first card gets its own group. 1, or card 0, but group 1. Choice, the choice card. Then the next group is phases of life or stages of life. Pretty self-explanatory. You got the child, the maiden, the youth, the mother, the father, the crone, the sage, and death and rebirth. So those are stages of life. This one is reasons for being. And we have knowledge, wisdom, healing, love, union, self, abundance, and destiny. And then the last group are the influence cards. And we have journey, thought, emotions, desire, perception, intuition, integrity, and faith. So again, very big deviation from the standard Rider Waite Smith, which is, you know, the Fool, the Magician, the High Priestess, the Empress, and the Emperor. And I think this is probably the biggest reason why I've heard so many people refer to Dreams of Gaia as a Oracle deck plus tarot deck. I think it's because of these major arcana cards being such a big change from the standard. But I think it's part of what, you know, makes it such a unique and sort of fun deck to work with. So I hope that gave you guys a brief little rundown of the Dreams of Gaia deck, and how it's a little bit different, but also a very unique and fun deck to work with. I hope I've given you some things to think about with it. So yeah, if anyone would like a bigger rundown of it, I can work on doing a video for all of the different suits and the major arcana and break them down a little bit more. But we'll see. Thanks for watching. Bye.